All right, we'll go ahead and get started. We'll start with prayer requests, praises. On my list, I have Diane Fotheringham. She's still in the hospital duty. Okay. We need to be praying for the family of Corey Estelle. She's the sister of Roberta and Michelle and the rest of that family. She passed away yesterday, James? Okay. At the same time, be praising for being prayers of praise for Kristen and Jason. They had their baby Grayson this week, and as far as I've heard, all is well. The Caligari families had a lot of loss this week, so we need to be praying for them. Somebody in the back's going to get mad at me, but John, you're having surgery this week?
The 12th.
The 12th. He didn't want me to say a whole lot, but we need to be praying for John's back surgery. He's going to smack me when we're done. That's okay. So be praying for John as he goes through that, and for Fran as she does her best to keep him in line. And you need the hearing things, John? Okay. Thanks, Stephen. That's what I thought. That's why I haven't been smacked yet. Anything else? Becky?
Procedure on my knee tomorrow. It should be fairly simple and go home and everything.
So pray for Bill and Aubrey. Pray for Becky with her knee procedure. Got it. Thanks, Steve. All right, what else? Anything else?
You got the Calgary's family. Calgary's related to Wojcinski, who lost their daughter, cancer earlier this week.
What was, I might need what John's wearing. What was that?
He said the Caligari.
Wojcinski family lost their daughter, cancer, and they were related to Calgary's.
Okay, gotcha.
Funeral was yesterday.
Okay, anything else? Okay, let's pray. Father God, thank you for today. Thank you for just being with us and for allowing us to serve you another day. Thank you for allowing us to be here today and for giving us the freedom that we have to worship you without fear of repercussion, Lord. Lord, I pray that we don't take that for granted. Lord, I thank you for the place that we live and the freedoms that we enjoy, and I pray that we'll use them to your glory. Lord, I pray that you'll be with all of us today as we worship. Be with us as we study from your word. Help us, Lord, to open our hearts and our minds to what Scripture has to say. Lord, I pray that you'll be with those of our congregation who are doing well right now. I pray especially that you'll be with Kristen and Jason as they celebrate Grayson. Pray that you'll continue to help him grow and help them to raise him in your faith, Lord. And Lord, I just pray that we'll do everything we can to help them. Lord, I pray that you'll be with Diane as she's in the hospital. She's been in the hospital a lot, Lord, and I just pray that you'll be with the doctors, that they'll be able to get her medication right, and she'll be back with us soon. I pray that you'll be with the family of Corey Estelle, prayerful of the Tewitts and the Bodners and the Van Meters and just their whole family as they're mourning that loss right now. Pray that you'll give them comfort and strength. Pray that you'll be with the Caligari and Wojcinski families as they're mourning the loss of their loved ones. I pray that you'll comfort them and help us to be a comfort to them as well. Pray that you'll be with John as he has back surgery on the 12th. I pray that you'll give him strength and be with the doctors, that they'll help him to be back to normal as quickly as possible. Pray that you'll be with Becky with her knee procedure, that will be smooth and easy, and she'll be back to doing what she does. And I just pray that you'll be with all those others that we may not know of or may have forgotten. Lord, I pray that you will be with us as we go throughout our walks every day, that we'll be examples, that we'll be the hands and feet of Jesus to those we come into contact with. I pray that you will help us never to take his sacrifice for granted, and I pray that you will help us to be thankful for this every day. I pray that you'll send him back soon, and it's through him that I pray. Amen. All right, we're in Acts chapter 24. So think about it when somebody has falsely charged you with something or said something about you that you just know is not true. How do you react? Do you retaliate? Do you become bitter? Do you give up? Do you curse God? You ever been accused of doing something you didn't do? Every person that comes in my door that's charged with a crime never did it. It's true. But thinking outside of that box, when somebody says something or accuses you of something, how does it make you feel?
What if your sibling usually retaliate?
Carrie said if it's your sibling, you usually retaliate. Right? What's that?
I'm the one that's at work, I usually just say my piece about that, like, no, I didn't. I'm not usually one to rat out the other person, but some people do.
Okay. So Carrie's not a rat.
Anger.
Anger? So, in thinking about this, how did Paul handle this? We're about to find out. We're about to find out through the rest of the book of Acts how he's handling this and how he's going to continue handling this. And I think we'll see that he trusted in God. Remember, he received that vision back in chapter 23, verse 11, and through it he was told that he would see Rome. And he believed it. And you'll notice there's one of the things I don't like is when we confuse meekness with weakness. And you're going to see Paul being a tremendous example of defending himself in a spirit of meekness. He didn't just stand by and allow a mob to carry him off to the execution table. He presented who he was and what he had done, but with respect. He used any opportunity that he had to evangelize, and at times, we're going to see that his defense becomes a gospel sermon. And this is going to bring him to all these different dignitaries as he makes his defense. Now, remember last week, we saw him be escorted after his arrest by 470 soldiers out of Jerusalem, just before the Jews arrived at the Tower of Antonia to request that Paul be allowed to come back to the Sanhedrin. And you can almost picture these Jews finding out that Paul's gone and the outrage that they probably would have expressed that Paul escaped again. And as we ended chapter 23 last week, we were introduced to this character named Felix. Remember Felix? Who's Felix? The procurator, the governor, the one who's in charge of this province. Claudius Lysias had sent Paul to Felix. Felix resided in Caesarea, and Felix had three responsibilities: collect the taxes, keep the peace, and command the military forces. And as military commander, he oversaw the provincial troops who were to preserve order and keep calm. And basically his decisions, his work as a judge, if you will, were almost always in cases of capital offense. And so Paul's being presented to this Felix, and let's see what happens. Somebody read chapter 24 and verse 1. And Bill, or whoever's back, if you could let me have the slides. Go ahead, Robert.
Now after 5 days, Ananias the high priest came down with the elders in a certain orator named Tertullus. These gave evidence to the governor against Paul.
All right, so who traveled to Caesarea to accuse Paul?
Ananias.
Ananias.
I just say high priest.
Okay, Ananias the high priest. Some elders.
Tertullus.
And a lawyer.
And a lawyer. I'm sorry I'm teaching today. Okay? What a name for an attorney, too. Tertullus. That's how I'm guessing you say his name. So 5 days could either refer to since Paul's departure from Jerusalem, 5 days after his arrival in Caesarea, 5 days after the Jews realized he was in Caesarea. We don't really know exactly what that 5 days is. but the Jews show up. And what's interesting to me is, if they felt so confident in their case, they could have shown up and presented their case without an attorney. But they go and hire this Tertullus. He's selected to bring the charge on their behalf. And the word attorney is translated here, orator. This is a margin note in some versions of your Bibles, but this word is rhetoros. This is where we get our English word rhetor or rhetoric, which is the persuasive use of language. And what this guy does, I call him a first century ambulance chaser, but as an attorney for a fee, he would present the case of a plaintiff or a defendant, much like we do today. And he'd bring before the court his knowledge of Roman law, especially by trying to use his eloquence to influence the judge on behalf of what he was representing. Now, judging from the way this guy talks, we're not sure if he was a Jew. Many people think he probably was either a Hellenistic Jew or a citizen of Rome, a non-Jew person. We don't know for sure, though. But it must be that they would recognize that they're going to have difficulty proving their case. So they go in, they hire this guy who's probably more familiar with Roman law, and they probably would have choked too on the necessary flattery that they're going to need to present their case to Felix. So they bring this guy in, and he comes in, and he gets ready to speak. Somebody read verses 2 through 4.
And when he was called upon, Tertullus began his accusation, saying, "Seeing that through you we enjoy great peace and prosperity is being brought to this nation by your foresight, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear, by your courtesy, a few words from us."
What are those three verses 2 through 4? When you read those, what does that make you think of?
He's kissing up.
He's kissing up. Thank you. That's exactly what he's doing. This is the what we call the exordium. Now, this was something that Cicero made popular, and the exordium, as this is called, begins with flattery of the judge that you're presenting before. It was instructions, rules that Cicero really expounded on, and the intention of this, the pure, complete intention of this, was literally to brown-nose your judge. To try to get the judge on your side by making him feel good, making him think, oh, well, this guy's praising me, so maybe I should rule in his favor. That's what the exordium was all about. Does anybody know anything about the administration Felix had, though? You ever done any outside study on this guy? His was not an administration that would be praised, because he was very guilty of a lot of corruption. He was a politician. The peace that Tertullus spoke of was probably one of the few positive contributions that Felix had made to Palestine, because he'd broken up bands of robbers. By force, he put down organized assassins. He put down several rebellions, but he'd done it with such severe ruthlessness that even moderate Jews didn't like this guy. Most citizens of Judea would say that peace existed in spite of him, not because of him. For example, it was during his administration that Jonathan the high priest was assassinated. And that was because the high priest went to him and said, "You need to be more worthy of your office." What's Felix do? Takes him out. Tertullus uses this word providence here. Do we know what that word means? Some versions may say something different. If I say you've got great providence, what am I saying?
You know a lot of stuff. You take
No.
care of things.
Yeah, you know a lot of stuff. You've got great foresight. At that time, men spoke of the providence of God, and there was a developing tendency to attribute such divine actions to the emperor, to the person who was in charge, who was a leader. And oftentimes, they would say the providence of Caesar. as a way of brown-nosing. Well, Tertullus went one step farther than all this, and he extended this phrase that was often used just for God and Caesar to Felix. Crimes are being eradicated because of your divine actions. But the reforms that Tertullus spoke of were few and far between, and within 2 years of this speech, Felix is getting shipped back to Rome to be put on trial for not doing his job correctly. And the only thing that saved him is that his brother had influence in the court there. But how does Tertullus address Felix here? We've talked a lot about this address. What's he say about this guy? Calls him most excellent. People are blessed everywhere because of you. But then after he gets done doing the brown-nosing, he says, and in effect, I'm not going to weary you or detain you too long. This is a sickening oration. I mean, this is just, he's implying, Felix, you're so busy keeping the peace, it'd be a shame to keep you away from your duties much longer. And he speaks as if he's obliged to restrain himself from these further words of praise and feelings that he wanted to utter. And so he says, through your kindness, listen to our case. Now somebody read verse 5 for us.
We have found this man to be a troublemaker who is constantly stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the cult known as the Nazarenes.
All right, so Tertullus starts off with these charges against Paul. And before he gets to any of the actual charges, do you notice what he does right off the bat? What's he call him?
Troublemaker.
So Carey's version says troublemaker. The New American Standard says pest. So right off the bat, this guy insults Paul. This guy's a pest, a loimon, a pestilence, a plague, an epidemic. He starts off his argument by insulting Paul and basically calling him a first-class troublemaker because he tried to make it personal. And then he gets this charge against him in verse 5. What's he call him? What's he say Paul's doing?
Stirring up riots.
He's stirring up riots. He's a disturber. He's stirring up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world. This is a political charge. He's referring to the Roman world and accusing Paul of being a disturber of the peace in Jewish communities. Now, this would have been the charge that's got the greatest influence to Felix, because what's he commissioned by the Roman government to do? Keep the peace. Was this charge really true?
Yeah, he incited riots everywhere he went.
So Judy's right on. There's an element of truth to this charge, because everywhere Paul went, he was disturbing the peace, wasn't he? But maybe not in the way that he's being accused of. Disorder occurred in many of the places that Paul went to. But who was it that was causing the riots? As we've looked through the book of Acts. The Jews, the Pharisees, the ones who have something against Paul. So what's Tertullus doing here? He's twisting. He's twisting what happened to make Paul out to be the disturber. But he wasn't really. Then in the same verse, after he calls Paul a disturber, what's he call him next? A ringleader. Ha! This guy's the ringleader. What does that actually mean? Because this word doesn't occur anywhere else in the New Testament. What's that?
Just like the leader.
Yeah, he's the organizer. This is the guy he's the standard bearer. He's the one who's trying to bring about, and Tertullus uses this word sect. Is that a nice word? Brandy says no. That's not really a nice description of it, isn't it? The Greek word for sect first meant something one chooses to do or believe, but then it became to be known as a party to which one belongs by choice. This is where we get our word heresy from. So to people in the first century, that word sect didn't have the harsh connotation that it might to our ears. Greek writers called all different schools of philosophy sects. So there wasn't this negative connotation then. But Tertullus says he's the ringleader of a certain sect of the Nazarenes. Where does that word come from? Nazarenes. Sorry, Graydon, am I going too fast? It's the birthplace of Christ. So the people that were following Christ, this was, well, let me ask you this. Was this an expression of blessing or contempt? It was sarcasm. This was an expression of contempt. This was meant to be an insult. This was a designation for the followers of Jesus. And they were doing this because, can anything good come from Nazareth? Okay? So this was an expression that was said about the followers of Christ as a way of being insulting. So what Tertullus had in mind, evidently, was that Paul was being accused of founding a new religion that was an offshoot of Judaism and therefore unlawful in the Roman Empire. The man didn't do his research. Because if he'd done his research, he would have seen that this sect was actually deemed to be lawful during one of Paul's other encounters. Somebody read verse 6 for us. So therein lies the third charge. What was the third charge? Desecrator. He's being alleged that he desecrated the temple. This is a religious charge. So you first got an insult, then you've got two political charges. Now you've got a religious charge. But do you notice anything different about this charge compared to when it was first brought against Paul? When this was first brought against Paul, there was another individual that was named with this charge. Earlier, the Jews charged Paul with taking Trophimus into the court of Israel. Now, they're content with simply saying he tried to simply desecrate the temple. This is more vague. And when it's more vague, it's harder to prove or disprove. And notice he doesn't mention Trophimus. Notice he just says he tried to profane the temple. If Trophimus had gone into the temple, Paul wouldn't have been the guilty one. Trophimus would have been. So you see how this attorney is twisting the words to make it look bad? But it gets even better. Somebody read we'll read verse 6 and let's read through verse 9.
Find out the truth of our accusations by examining him yourself. Then the other Jews chimed in, declaring that everything Tertullus said was true.
So, was Tertullus correct about who made the arrest? Refresh my memory, but I don't remember too many Jews trying to legally arrest Paul. Do you? What were they doing to Paul?
They were trying to kill him.
They were trying to kill him. They were beating the snot out of him. It was a mob attack. But Tertullus says, we arrested him. Kind of a little bit of an exaggerated description of what was nearly an execution, right? The mob scene in chapter 22 could hardly be referred to as a formal arrest. So he's manipulating more details, trying to convince the court to support his case. Now, some versions include this, and they have it in brackets. Some versions don't because there's a dispute about the manuscripts. But, for example, the Syriac and the Vulgate versions of the text include this little piece that says, "We wanted to judge him according to our own law, but Lysias the commander came along and with much violence took him out of our hands, ordering his accusers to come before you." Who does he lay that violence on if we accept that as part of the manuscript? Lysias. Yeah. Not the Jews. He's saying the arrest would have been completely perfect and followed in due course by a legal trial, but this Lysias came by for an uncalled for interruption that made this thing really violent. What's funny about this? Again, this attorney didn't do his homework, didn't have all the evidence. What does Tertullus not know that Lysias has done? Wrote that letter. Remember, he sent that letter with Paul when Paul went to Caesarea saying, here's what happened, Felix. You get to make the decision now on this man's trial. So this Tertullus doesn't know that Lysias has already provided him with an explanation of what happened. Now remember, Lysias also twisted the words in that letter. But it's a bit of a different story from what Tertullus is telling us, isn't it? I kind of think that's funny, but that's my sick and twisted humor. So how does Tertullus try to make the Jews look? What's that? Good? Fair? Lawful and orderly? Completely not what they were? I mean, he's trying to make it look like they gave him a fair trial. And then what do the Jews do? They agree with him. This is the part of the speech that Tertullus is giving where they were joining in with amens. Amen. That's right. That's right. Praise the Lord. He's right on. And they're swearing falsely that the accusation against Paul are true in every word. Now, you can accuse somebody of just about anything. But what's the problem here with what Tertullus has done? He's missing a big thing, and it starts with an E.
Evidence.
Evidence! He's got no evidence. He's got no witnesses. Even the ones who are accusing Paul aren't here. You find that funny, Graydon?
Yeah, what he's trying to do is call him out. Ringleader of the Nazarenes, but none of the stuff that he's mentioning is against Roman law. And his accusers, the Jews from Asia, aren't there. And a Roman citizen has a right to face his accusers.
There's an echo in here. You nailed it, man. That's a great way to say it. In Roman law, if you were accused of something, you had the right to face your accuser. Doesn't sound any different from today, does it? And where are the accusers? They're not there. This is absolutely silly by these Jews and by this attorney. I mean, this is ridiculous. But there's his case. That is his case in chief. And he's done. So if you were going to summarize this case, remember again the three charges. He's a troublemaker, he's a disturber, he's a ringleader, and he's a desecrator. Now, if these charges are true, how serious are these? If they're true?
Still not against Roman law.
But against Jewish law, punishable by death. If he's a desecrator of the temple, that's the one capital offense that the Jews could carry out just by telling the Romans they had to do this because their temple was desecrated. They wanted him so out of circulation that they were willing to make a solemn affirmation that a lie was a truth. Now, of course, that was prohibited in the law. Exodus 20:16, you shall not bear false witness. And what are they doing? This is the prime example of bearing false witness. They're doing whatever they can to get him convicted. I think, this is my theory, they were hoping that Paul would mess up in his defense. They were hoping Paul would say something that would convict him of his crimes, since they didn't have any evidence or witnesses. But this is awesome, because look at what happens next. Somebody read verses 10 and 11.
And when the governor had motioned to him to speak, Paul replied, realizing that for many years you have been judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. As you may ascertain, it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship at Jerusalem.
So as I read this, I'm wondering if the Jews were hoping that Felix would next interrogate Paul based on these charges. And when Felix instead gives Paul the nod that he has the floor, you can almost see some disappointment on their faces. So Paul gets this beckoning, either a nod or a hand wave, saying, it's now your turn. And you can't help but think of what Jesus promised his apostles in Luke chapter 21 when you look at this. Somebody turn to Luke 21 and read verses 12 through 18 for us. Luke 21, 12 through 18.
But before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. You will be brought before kings and rulers for name's sake. But it will turn out for you as an occasion for testimony. Therefore, settle in your hearts not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer. For I will give you a mouth of wisdom, for all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist. How far?
Through 18, please.
You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but not a hair of your head shall be lost.
Does that sound familiar to what Paul's going through right now? I think it's a great example. Paul's now required, and I'm going to say without notification of the charges, without a moment for preparation, even though he probably had an idea of what the 3 charges would be, he now is required to make his defense against these accusations, which, if sustained in the Jewish court, would cost him his life. He has no witnesses to support his response. He's only relying on the self-evident truthfulness of what he might have to say. How precious must that promise of Jesus been to him at that moment? I will guide you into what to say. And what does he do? Now look at what Paul's defense is. Do you see Paul start with a bunch of flattery? You don't see that. Instead, Paul does something else. He appeals to Felix's many years that Felix was actually a judge. Felix actually administered the law in Samaria and after that in Judea, and that would have helped him to understand Paul's defense. Because of his experience as a judge in Judea and Samaria, he would have understood the customs and the habits of the Jews and understood Paul's case. And Paul says, with a little investigation, you're going to learn the truth. It's not been more than 12 days earlier that I went to Jerusalem. Now, quite often when a long period of time intervenes between an event and an investigation, it's often difficult to reconstruct what happens. But in this case, Paul's saying the time is short enough, Felix, that we can easily determine what's happened. And I didn't go to Jerusalem to start a riot. I went to worship. I went to deliver alms. Now, you can calculate the 12 days however you want to. I would encourage you to study that outside of class. We're not going to get into figuring out how many those 12 days were. But Paul's point is, I went to Jerusalem for peaceful purposes, not disruptive intentions. Somebody read verses 12 and 13.
My accusers never found me arguing with anyone in the temple, nor stirring up a riot in any synagogue or on the streets of the city. These men cannot prove the things they accuse me of doing.
So Paul starts out by saying, I'm not a troublemaker, and they can't prove anything that they said. Now think about this. During this time, do you recall us studying if Paul preached in the temple? He didn't, that we know of. When they found him, they didn't find him preaching in the temple. They didn't find him preaching even in the city of Jerusalem. Paul wasn't doing anything inflammatory or riot-causing. He'd gone quietly and peacefully about his business, trying to placate the Jerusalem elders who were concerned that his presence might cause problems. And then he says, let me talk about this accusation that I'm stirring up Jews all over the empire. Again, you can't prove this, and the record of Acts is clear on that. It was the unbelieving Jews who caused the riots. And Paul challenges them, Just like in Jewish law, if you want to prove your case, you've got to bring how many witnesses? At least two. Who can prove that I've done this? Then he goes on to the next charge. Somebody read verses 14 through 16.
However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets, and I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man.
So, what does Paul do? He admits that he's part of this accused sect. But he doesn't call it a sect like Felix did, or like Tertullus did. He says, I'm part of the way. I'm part of the way about which you spoke, which is the true way of God. This religion called Christianity was exactly what had been promised by the law and the prophets, and Paul identifies himself with these accusers by saying, I serve the God of our fathers. For Felix, that should have had some special meaning, because the God Paul served was the God his fathers had served, the God the Israelites had served, identifying him with his accusers. And under Roman law, he had every right to do so. The way Paul served God was different from the way the Pharisees and the Sadducees served, but Paul says this is in harmony with the Scriptures. I'd found the Christianity in the culmination of the law and the fulfillment of the prophets. In other words, Paul's denying that Christianity is an illegal religion. It's not a sect. It was the way for which Judaism had been preparing the world. Paul's saying, those accusers are still looking for this Messiah to come. I believe he's already come. And his resurrection from the dead provides assurance of the resurrection for all men. That's a pretty powerful passage, because if his accusers say, oh, that's not true, well, mixed in with those accusers were some Pharisees, right? What did they believe in? The resurrection of the dead? So if they say, well, that's not true, Paul, we don't believe that, what are they saying? We don't believe what we believe. We don't believe this thing we fight for against the Sadducees all the time. So Paul's basically standing before Felix and saying, I'm an innocent man. This is why I live my life. It's my constant aim, so that my conscience will be clear. I live my life in such a way that I am free of the suspicion of any of these charges lodged against me. And the only way I can do that is by living the way God's required me to. I'm doing my best. But then he goes on to answer that third charge. Somebody read verses 17 through 21.
After several years away, I returned to Jerusalem with money to aid my people and to offer sacrifices to God. My accusers saw me in the temple as I was completing a purification ceremony. There was no crowd around me and no rioting. But some Jews from the province of Asia were there, and they ought to be here to bring charges if they have anything against me. Ask these men here what crime the Jewish High Council found me guilty of, except for the one time I shouted out, I am on trial before you today because I believe in the resurrection of the dead.
So if Felix was nodding off at this point, in verse 17, he woke back up because he heard the word alms. Remember, Felix was money hungry. And so when Felix heard this, one of the first things that probably went through his mind was, oh, this guy must have some prosperity. And that may have been what started the whole process of the next 2 years. But Paul presents this third defense, saying, let me tell you why I went to Jerusalem. It wasn't to profane or desecrate the temple. I went to Jerusalem to bring my countrymen, my fellow Jews who were in distress, charitable contributions and alms. These were large sums of money. And Paul then goes on to say, when I was arrested, I wasn't preaching. What was I doing? He was worshiping God in the temple. That's not rioting. At the very time they found me, I'm in the midst of offering sacrifices regarding a vow. That's far from being there to profane and desecrate a temple. I'm going through all the processes of purification. And if they really wanted to see that, they could have verified that through temple records. Again, no evidence. And the Jews from Asia who originated these accusations, Paul says, aren't even here. They went back to Asia. Where are my accusers? These men don't have any firsthand evidence of anything that they're alleging. This is hearsay. The people who claim to be witnesses of this didn't even trouble to come see you, Felix. They sent these messengers. Paul said his accusers should state the misdeeds they discovered when he was before the council. And the only thing he could be guilty of was what? Remember what he said in verse 6 of chapter 23, Haley? Say that louder.
He yelled once.
He yelled one time, and what did he say?
That
I'm on trial for my belief in
Resurrection.
the resurrection. Notice how Paul keeps working that back in.
Keeps causing a division.
Well, in 23, he was causing a division. But here, he's working that back into his presentation to Felix. Let me tell you about the resurrection, because that's why I'm here. The only point that these accusers could make against me is that I was referring to the resurrection of the dead. But Paul wasn't apologizing. Paul's saying, this is why I'm on trial. And the only thing I'm guilty of is doing the job that I was called to do. That's pretty powerful. So Paul's defense contains a direct reply to each of the specific charges brought against him. He points out that his visit to Jerusalem was short enough that it would have been easy to ascertain if he was causing riots or agitating anybody, that the way Christianity is not an illegal religion, but was what was predicted in the law and the prophets. Instead of profaning the temple, Paul had been there using it as a place to make sacrifices and promises to God. And at the end of the trial, he calls on the Sanhedrin to say, present your witnesses. Present your evidence. Was this a good defense? Those of you who like to watch Law and Order, was this a good defense? Very good defense. I'm trying to liven you up. I know this is tough. This was a very good defense. If Felix hadn't been motivated by greed and a desire to abide the Jews, at this point Paul would have been acquitted and set free. And you can picture the faces of his accusers. Probably some in rage, probably some embarrassed. If believing in the resurrection was the crime, then the Pharisees amongst the Jews that day were also guilty just like Paul. And they had no answer. So what does Felix do? Somebody read verses 22 and 23.
At that point, Felix, who was quite familiar with the way, adjourned the hearing and said, wait until Lysias, the garrison commander, arrives. Then I will decide the case. He ordered an officer to keep Paul in custody, but to give him some freedom and allow his friends to visit him and take care of his needs.
So, do you think these accusers really understood the knowledge and awareness that Felix had about the Jews and about Christianity? I don't think so. Remember, Caesarea was filled with evangelizers. Who was living there at the time that we remember? Starts with a P. Philip. There were other Christians there too, so Felix had probably had some familiarity with Christianity. We don't know for sure where he got this from, but he knew enough about the life and doctrines of the Jews to know Paul wasn't guilty of a crime. And so what's he do? In effect, he puts it off. When Lysias comes down, then I'll decide the case. But you know what we don't have any evidence of? We don't have any evidence that he actually brought Lysias down to talk about this case. In fact, he really didn't need to, because he had everything from Lysias he needed in that letter. But Paul says, I'm going to appease these guys for right now. I'm going to keep Paul. In a sense, neither side wins their case. And Paul's kept in custody. And from there, we'll pick up next week as we venture into Acts chapter 25, verses 1 through 12. I will point out, you'll notice if you're paying attention, we're going to skip verses 24 through 27 of chapter 24. We will come back to those in a couple weeks, so don't be alarmed. Next week, we're going to jump from where we're at to chapter 25, verses 1 through 12. Thank you all.